YouTube. And I think we are looking pretty good. Perfect. All right. I always, whenever I put us on YouTube, I always want to check and make sure that I have the volume muted, because I'll start talking and we'll start a presentation, and then all of a sudden you'll hear YouTube going in the background. So, and that's no fun, right? That's kind of distracting. I want to welcome everybody today to our 10th session in the Gospel of Luke. We are entering into chapter 5. I'm hoping our pace will quicken a little bit more. Who knows? We'll see. But we're just making our way through and enjoying this gospel, learning a lot from Luke. Even though this is our second time engaging this, at least since I've been able to teach here at Colonial. Let's see here, I've got a question for us that I'm going to put in the chat and put you into groups for a little intro conversation. Let's do that here. So it comes up in the chat there and it says, how does the gospel disrupt our daily lives? How does the gospel disrupt your daily life? And one of the dynamics that you see actually as you're reading through the Gospels and the story of Jesus is that there is something disruptive about Jesus's ministry, Jesus's way of being. It upsets some of our apple carts, ways of how we expect things ought to go, etc. And that doesn't just leave once Jesus is dies on the cross and is raised from the dead. That continues to be a part of the Christian experience, actually. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of reflect a little bit on this as we're heading into this next chapter, where we're going to have yet more disruptive kinds of interesting scenes in the life of Jesus. So I'm going to put you into breakout groups, and I think we'll just go ahead and create 2 large groups. And I'll give you about 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm going to open all the rooms now. Go ahead and click on your invitation, have a conversation, and then I'll see you in a few minutes when you get back. Okay. Here comes everyone. All right. Okay, great to see everybody. I've got everybody muted right now, so if you'd like to share, please be sure to unmute yourself. So I gave you this question. How does the gospel disrupt our daily lives? How does the gospel disrupt your daily life? As a chance, sort of a reflection question. So what were some of the things that you discussed in your groups in reference to this question? Elgin, did you have something?
No, I just noticed that Jean raised her hand.
I was adjusting my light.
That's good enough, Jean.
I will raise my hand though. Anne said, he disrupts me not enough.
Yeah, right.
That's good. That's yeah. It's like, you know, that you've been disrupted, but it's like, boy, sometimes you think, man, I could probably use being disrupted a little bit more. Interesting. Nice observation, Anne.
We had quite a bit of discussion on whether you could really call God's speaking to you a disruption.
Mm.
We had some people that didn't like that word disruption.
Oh,
right,
really?
Sally?
Well, that was kind of what I said at the end. Disruption can be a negative or a positive. Because I think back to when I was introduced to Young Life, that was a disruption. That was a different path. That was a whole new life for me and for David. But it was, even though it was a disruption, it wasn't a negative.
Right. It was a blessing. So
absolutely.
So I, where are the blessings in my lives that the gospel has brought to me anyway?
Right. So disruption, what's a different word we might use?
Well, we came up with guiding that was one word.
Okay. Christian, why did you choose disruption as your word?
Because I think that's what the gospel does.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the gospel disrupts our lives, that we order our lives in a certain kind of way, not necessarily good or bad, but the order of our life is not equatable with what God is trying to do with us necessarily, and it has to be disrupted from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we talk about the Christian life as a kind of ongoing path and growth. And I think we all would not acknowledge that we're continuing to grow and change. And in that process of growth and change, there's going to be some disruption, right? If we think about it from the viewpoint of an organic metaphor, the plant has got to push through the soil, right? It's got to disrupt the soil. So that's the way I tend to think about that the gospel does come in. And part of that's because of my own Christian experience. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily everybody's experience, but my life was going in one particular direction, and then it was radically disrupted by God. And every now and then I get disrupted again. And sometimes those are hard experiences, but oftentimes they're ultimately, I think, for the good. They're still a blessing in the way that kind of Sally was talking about. So I tend to think that that's kind of the way that, to a certain extent, the pattern, right, that we experience, especially if we kind of read through these gospels. People have one set of expectations, and those expectations get disrupted or overturned, or something different happens than what we think is going to happen, I suppose. So that's kind of where I was coming from, at least in terms of my use of that term. I do think, of course, there are other ways of talking about it, but some of the scenes we're getting ready to enter into, there is some interesting disruptive elements, I suppose I would say.
I look upon it as sometimes I look upon, first of all, Jesus as my best friend. And I would hate to think my best friend was always just disrupting me. But I look upon it as guidance, heavy guidance, and sometimes that guidance is disruptive. But
Yeah.
it's still a close friend guiding me.
Yeah,
There-
yeah, and
there-
I think they could be like, it's kind of like the way you were saying it, Peggy. I think that these things can be combined. They don't have to be an either or necessarily, but yeah, that's a great way of putting it, actually.
There was a song that just came to me called "The Marvelous Peace of God," but it starts off contented, peaceful fishermen before they ever knew the marvelous peace of God. You know, and then it goes through talking about the things that happened to Peter and John, and but it says, "But brothers, pray for one thing, the marvelous peace of God."
Yeah, and actually, speaking of, we're getting ready to go into the scene when the disciples, you know, at the height, potentially at the height of their career, give up their inherited or chosen. It's not made entirely clear to us vocations, and do something different. And so that, again, that's kind of where I was coming from in terms of these background scenes. So, well, this is good. It's always interesting to hear how each of us thinks differently, kind of about the way that we are encountered by the gospel, or by God's power or God's presence in our life. I am going to share my screen here. And here, we'll start here. So that's our opening question. So just to kind of remind us of where we are, we have traveled through the first 4 chapters, which includes, of course, the prologue, infancy narrative, preparation, and then public inauguration of the ministry of Jesus, up to the end of chapter 4. And now we are preparing to transition into chapters 5 and 6. They kind of hold together, and I'll just make a couple of comments about that in just a few minutes. So we're still very much at the beginning of our story, but I think it'd be fair to say that, at least in terms of the flow of Luke, we've gotten a lot of groundwork. Like Luke's doing a lot of, I think it'd be fair to say, he's laying a lot of groundwork in these early chapters, having to do with the identity of Jesus, right? Who exactly is Jesus? Why should Jesus be followed? What is Jesus about? We get all of that in these first few chapters, with his public ministry, where he makes this declaration, quoting a passage from the book of Isaiah. Then we get scenes, if you remember, right after that in chapter 4, we get scenes of Jesus actually fulfilling the words, right? Enacting release, setting a man free from a demonic power, and healing a woman. And so again, sort of, and I think last week we really stressed how important, or sort of a sub-theme for Luke, is that word and deed, or word and action, are tightly bound together for Jesus, right? So much so that even when a demonic power comes forth from this man who's possessed and confesses that Jesus is the Holy One of God, Jesus silences it. And I think one of the meanings of that, not necessarily the whole, but one of the meanings of that, Jesus's command is, and we sort of I took this from a commentator that I think has a lot of truth to it, is that just because this power is orthodox in its sort of doctrine, doesn't necessarily mean its witness is trustworthy, right? And so this fits very much. Every time I think about that passage, I think of John Wesley, who says, that the devil is as orthodox as the day is long, but is very far from the religion of the heart. And that's sort of the point, I think, to a certain extent. But that composite, the reason for that, of course, is to give us that composite picture, in a sense, of the trustworthiness of Jesus, right? That he is someone who should be followed, right? Because he, not only because of what he represents, who he is, but because he's true to his word, right? That might be a way of thinking about it. Much like Yahweh is true to Yahweh's word, Jesus is true to his word. So then it makes sense, right? That now, as we shift, and I think I mentioned to you last week, that Luke sort of rearranges the disciple callings. In Mark and Matthew, the calling of the disciples shows up earlier in their telling of the story. And Luke is the one who sort of pushes that a little bit further back into the story. And I think it makes sense to think about it as Luke has established precisely why these disciples would have followed Jesus to a certain extent, right? They would have known about him. They would have known he was trustworthy, etc. So without further ado, let's jump in to our first passage. If I get a volunteer who's willing to read.
I'll do it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Once while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long but have caught nothing. Yet, if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him.
All right. Thank you very much. If you hear any squeaking in the background, I apologize. It's because there's a small dog at my feet playing with a squeaky toy. So I hope that it's not, you can't actually hear it.
Better to squeak than bark.
Yeah, squeaking that's good. I'm glad to hear that, Terry. Squeaking is better than barking. That's right. Okay, so a couple of comments then here as we start. And some of this I've already kind of mentioned, right? We've if we remember all the way back to the opening of the gospel, we know that what Luke was intending to do was to offer an orderly account. We talked about how that phrase was actually something that you might find in the historiography of the ancient world. So Luke is understanding himself to a certain extent to be working according to ancient canons of history. But one of the things that we also emphasized is that orderly account here has more to do with logical as opposed to precisely plotting out how things exactly happened, right? Luke, like the other gospel writers, has no problem moving certain details around because the overarching agenda is in some ways to give an orderly or more logical account. And that this is one of those places where Luke's account differs in a significant way, we might say, from, it doesn't necessarily, fundamentally differ because Jesus still calls his disciples, but it certainly differs in terms of timing, right? And we've already mentioned that a couple of different times. So this is the chapter when we're entering in for the call of the disciples. We'll start to hear a little bit more about that throughout the rest of this section. And of course, as I mentioned, we could say that this might seem to be out of order if the issue is precisely plotting exactly where and how things happened. But I think it's fair to say that there's more at play here which has to do with Luke having set a scene and offered a rationale for why the disciples would want to follow Jesus, right? They would have heard about him. They would have already known about him. And we get at least, I think, 2 different phrases, as well as several scenes that tell us that word about Jesus is spreading throughout the countryside. And so this obviously adding to the rationale for, because what they're going to do, by the way, is pretty crazy. I mean, it's disruptive. This is, again, where I was coming from. They're going to basically, I mean, think about this. They're going to pull in the catch of a lifetime as fishermen and then just give up being fishermen. I mean, think about that. Like if you were a business person and you made the deal of the century and then you just cashed it in and walked away absolutely totally from business altogether and did something completely different. That's what we're talking about here when we utilize some of that language about disruption. So what can we say? I could just say just a couple of comments about chapters 5 through 6, because this is sort of a little sub area that hangs together nicely, and it really does. It kind of makes up. It's made up of what we might say are 2 overarching themes. And the first, of course, is the calling of the disciples, which we're encountering now, and then we now start to really get the more concrete controversies with the religious authorities, right? We've already noted from the very beginning, right, that there's going to be conflict, right? That on the one hand, Jesus has come, right? I mean, think about it. On the one hand, Emmanuel, right? Jesus, the Messiah, Savior, Lord, right? Announced by angels, right, etc., has come. He has announced the year of the Lord's favor. That's how he understands his own ministry, right? And yet, on the other hand, there are many who are not going to be able to hear what he has to say, and not just out of ignorance. Some of them are not going to want to hear what he has to say, right? There's going to be conflict. And we've already seen a little bit here and there. We see a couple little shadow scenes of that. Well, now that really begins to take on, this is sort of the first place where it really starts to take on flesh in this section and moving forward. And it's particularly, as I say here, the religious authorities. It's not necessarily everyday people. And I am very definitely studiously avoiding the use of the Jews because of the pejorative kind of connotations that's taken on in the history of Christianity. And also because, for goodness sakes, Jesus himself is Jewish, and so are all of his disciples, and so are all the common people who respond positively to him. So religious authorities, I think, is a more precise and better way of thinking about what's happening here. The second thing that I just thought was interesting as I was kind of preparing, that I think is kind of noteworthy, given the fact that we are reading Luke, who does seem to be more interested in something like historical chronology, even though we've noted, and I just noted a few moments ago, that ancient notions of historical chronology are not necessarily the same as modern, is that the time signatures in a lot of these scenes, particularly in this section, are quite vague. So you'll be like, once he was doing this, and then once he was doing that. And exactly how they connect together is not necessarily made totally clear. But all of this stuff does kind of fit together. And it is Luke's attempt to begin to cohere that there is a company of people who are going to be following Jesus, and they're going to have a confrontation with others who fundamentally oppose Jesus. So we might want to be thinking about it in that kind of sensibility. Okay, so let's jump in then to our verses. So verses 1 through 3. Once while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw 2 boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from that shore, or from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. All right, so a few comments here. This is another difference, just to note here. If we look at the calling scenes, in Mark and Matthew, Luke's calling scene is preceded by a teaching moment, right? And that moment of Jesus himself on the lake of Gennesaret. As you can see here, Gennesaret is another name for Sea of Galilee. I'm not sure if this is an Aramaic derivation or not. I don't think I noted that when I was doing some of the research. But this does sort of give to us a sense of where Jesus is, right? I mentioned this to you when Jesus left Nazareth and he went to Capernaum, he was going into a more mixed area where there would have been more Gentiles, and so the vision, of course, is God or Yahweh entering into enemy territory or territory that has not fully been taken back. And then the first thing he does is cast a demon out of a person. So we're in Gennesaret. We're on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. We're in a place of Jews and Gentiles, and Jesus is teaching. Well, what's he teaching? It says here in verse 3 or verse 1, the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God. So one of the things I think is really interesting in this is the grammar here precludes the idea that what the crowds want to hear are words about God. Literally, the grammar signifies that when Jesus is speaking, it has a sort of divine authority. So it literally is the word of God. People are straining to hear this word. They're longing and wanting to hear it and pressing against Jesus in ways that kind of make you feel the scene here, as well as a couple of other scenes in this chapter, feel a little bit claustrophobic, right? Of people just kind of crowding in and pressing in on Jesus and him having to escape away, as we heard actually towards the end of chapter 4, to lonely places. So again, God's word present in an area that we might that sort of in the cosmography of an ancient world person, they would have thought they would actually think of certain geographical areas as this one belongs to God and this one does not belong to God, or it still belongs to enemy hands. And again, Galilee, right, as a place of mixture, mixed both by Gentiles and Jews, that would have been understood in that way. And what do I mean by that? It's not just that there are Gentiles living there, it's that there are going to be pagan and other kinds of apparatus, right? You're going to have statues, you're going to have temples, you're going to have non-kosher food, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I mean when we talk about a territory that it doesn't quite fully feel like somehow it belongs to Yahweh. So God's word is being spoken, in other words, into an area that we might consider chaos to a certain extent. And that's some of the background to the fact that Jesus is now getting ready to get to stand on the water and teach the crowds. And so this kind of moves us a little bit further. The last thing, just as a notice, is we've already heard about Simon. We heard about Jesus going into Simon's house. So he hasn't really been introduced though as a character, as someone who has his own voice until this scene, right? So literally just prior to this, we hear about Simon's mother-in-law being ill and Jesus going into her house and healing her. So there may be some connection, but that connection doesn't feel deep yet. I think it'd be fair to say. So, but these are again some of the kind of the detail pieces that Luke is not quite as worried. So what does he do? He makes his way into Simon's boat, and then eventually, as it says, then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. And this, of course, has been pushed out a little bit apart from the shore. The symbolism here is really rich. And it gets back to this whole idea of the Galilee as a mixed place, and God's word being spoken into a place of what we might consider chaos. And all of a sudden, Jesus is now standing on the water teaching the people. It sounds like the first chapter of Genesis, basically, right? that the stilling of the water, right? That the presence of hold up for a second. Sid! I may have to go close the shade. I think he sees an animal outside. Give me 1 second. I apologize. I don't want to cause any major issues for people in the background. Okay, relatively fast. That wasn't too bad. Almost about as good as changing the oil, right? So anyway, this, as I said, the symbolism here, right, is pretty interesting, right? Of God remaking, right, speaking into a situation of chaos in order to remake something new, and perhaps Luke is kind of playing with some of this imagery in the background. Certainly, this scene conjures a lot of that. Let me stop though and see what kind of comments or questions you might have from this first couple of verses.
Is that Simon Peter?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, speak up.
I think it's really interesting that Simon argued with him when Jesus said what they were going to do. And he says, well, we worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. And then he kind of feels bad and he says, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. So, but I think it's sometimes we kind of do the same thing. But no, that's not going to work. And then maybe we need to obey. So
yeah, it's a kind of an interesting reluctant exchange.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
he's like,
Very
okay. Well, and I think one of the things too that's really interesting about it is that Jesus is not a fisherman. So it's like he's not even it's not even his vocation or discipline. But they're like, all right, we're gonna humor you because we've heard good things about you. But yeah, there's no fish out here right now. But we're gonna do it anyway because you asked us. And that it does have that feel to it, right? I feel, at least from my perspective, it certainly does when you kind of read through it.
Which probably made his remarks have even more power, because this is a guy who isn't even a fisherman and he knows where the fish are.
Right. Well, they have to find that out, of course, but I think you're absolutely right.
But later, I mean, after he's done it, it has power because he shouldn't have known that.
That's right. And then we hear Simon's response, right? Which is it dawns on him in a sense. It doesn't necessarily dawn on him, you know, that he knows that Jesus is the Son of God and all those kind of things, but he clearly knows that Jesus is special, unique. Maybe he even has an idea that he's the Messiah, right? And so all the things that he's heard about him up to now, all the scenes that Luke has conveyed to us, Jesus is true to his word, right?
Well, and there is no circumstance that he cannot interrupt and correct. I mean,
that's right. That's absolutely right. There's no.
He tailors it to the need, to the, you know, the self-importance that fellow felt like, well, we haven't caught anything, so, you know, I think he tailors it to wherever we are in our obedience or disobedience.
That's a great word, actually. I think that's absolutely right. At this scene, and then
I can't hear Suzanne. What was the word she used?
That he tailors.
A bunch of words. Which one?
Well, she was saying, Diane, she was saying that Jesus can disrupt any situation or setting, and that he tailors his words.
Tailors his words
to that setting, like he makes it kind of speak in, makes it appropriate in a sense.
Well, you said Simon had already met Jesus when Jesus healed his mother-in-law. So Simon should have had a little bit of a clue of Jesus having a little bit of power and exceptional, I don't know, way about him.
That's true. That is true. And it does sort of make the stark reaction that Simon has in this particular story. It sort of takes a little bit of the intensity out of it. If you remember that we've already met Simon in one scene earlier, but I still think that like that scene, even though I also think it's the same Simon, it's the same Simon Peter and same Simon Peter's mother-in-law as the Peter that we're hearing about now. That because Simon doesn't talk and because we haven't had the calling scene yet, there's still he's still kind of an ambivalent side figure perhaps. And it's really this scene where he's kind of confronted in some ways at the very center of his identity, maybe we might think. Like it's important. I think like it's probably important on the one hand that it's his mother-in-law. So it's someone close to him, but they're not as close as his mother would be, which might shake him to his core. But now here, in terms of his vocation, his vocational calling, and more than likely he was the son of a fisherman. I mean, I think that's a pretty good guess that we would not be wrong to assume. And so there is sort of it is interesting here, so making sense of the earlier scene in its connection to this one, that leaves a lot of open doors, I think.
But aren't we the same way where we need encounter upon encounter upon encounter?
Yeah.
And that when we do hear and obey what we've heard, that we do grow, we do learn, we do you begin to trust even more and follow even more and love even more.
Yeah, that's a great point. I really love that. One of the things that I always sort of take solace in when I read through the Gospels is how clueless the disciples are. Because I know I'm clueless. Like I know that I'm trying my best to follow Jesus, and I'm not great at it. I'm some days I'm pretty good. Other days I'm not great. I don't always know what to say at the right time when I'm talking to someone. I'm not always servant-hearted. I'm not always thinking, you know what I mean? Like, it's just that normal thing of being human and trying your best. And so needing that encounter again and again, like you were saying, Sally, I think that's a great, because it really does start here. If we think about Simon, there's going to be several interchanges between Jesus and Simon in which Simon clearly doesn't get it yet. And he's really not going to get it in some ways until we turn to the next volume, right? The book of Acts. Then we really see sort of somehow it's kind of finally baked in for him. But even there, he has to learn new things, right? He has to learn that the Gentiles are going to be called in, etc. So he's a guy who is capable of having mistakes. And I think that's comforting for a lot of folks. It's certainly comforting for me. Any other comments before I move us forward?
I remember Bob Mumford mentioned, who was a teacher, said a good disciple gets it wrong. They had just fed the 5,000 and they're going across the lake. And he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And they go, what did he say? He says, we forgot the bread.
Right, yeah. We forgot to bring the bread or the yeast or whatever. And he's like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's right. That's great. That's good. All right, so just following then through the scene, we've already kind of actually made a few comments that hit on some of what I want to highlight for us in the remainder. So let me just read through a few of these verses here. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. All right. So, filled with overflowing, right, is sort of the vision here. So first of all, we have in these verses, we have kind of a strange interchange. I think it's fair to say. And what I mean by that is not only that Jesus is not a fisherman and he makes this comment, which of course is true. That is strange. But it's the fact that he even asks him to do it. It's sort of a weird kind of out of the blue sort of a thing, right? Jesus was just in the boat at the courtesy of these fishermen, not to fish, but to teach. And so now he's giving instruction on fishing, and that is odd. Simon, though, responds with a term of respect. So he doesn't treat Jesus, and maybe this echoes back to our earlier scene that we've talked about a couple of times now back in chapter 4 with his mother-in-law. He doesn't treat him like a local yokel or something. He calls him master, right? This is a term of respect. And more than likely, this is rooted in his experience with his mother-in-law. So, and the last thing, then, I think it'd be fair to say, if we really were going to say this scene offers us an interesting dynamic for thinking about what discipleship means. We have here a command, and then someone attempting to obey that command. They might have some hesitations about it, right? And Simon does seem to echo those, but nevertheless he follows through, right? And this is actually a pattern that shows up in quite a few of the Gospels. The Gospel of John, in particular, is very fond of this. That God asks for something, or that Jesus commands something. And obedience actually results not just in obedience to the command and the fulfilling of it, but to the blessing of the one who's obedient, right? And that's clearly what we have here with this massive and miraculous haul of fish. So that happens, and then of course Peter, something dawns on Peter. There's someone in my boat that I shouldn't be, they shouldn't be here, in a sense. Like, this is not a holy place, and I'm not a holy person. And he may be thinking about that on moral terms, or he may be thinking about that in cultic terms, right? Like, this is not a temple, and I'm not a priest. Could be another way of thinking about what he's saying. But he says, but when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon, right? So we get this confession from Peter, and quite actually rather dramatically. And it echoes actually back into Isaiah chapter 6. If you're familiar with this scene, Isaiah is transported into the temple, into the presence of the Holy of Holies, in the presence of the Lord. And he basically says, woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips, and I come from a people of unclean lips. And the angel reaches down and grabs a coal from the fire and cleanses his lips in that scene. And so there's something here, again, that has an echo of that sense. That he is truly in the presence of someone who is holy, as it says, as I say here. And I think it'd be fair to say, as I mentioned here, in a way we don't hear about the response of others, but Peter kind of becomes a sort of stand-in, right? Both in the form of the earlier notion, right, of obeying the command, but also now in the form of a confession, right, of knowing, in a sense, that there is someone who is greater than he, in whose presence he is now standing. Then we get Jesus's response, right? So it says here, then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." And what a turn of phrase. First of all, I mean, just as a sort of linguistic, right? moment, a turn, like a turn of phrase. You're a fisherman, but no longer are you going to be fishing fish. You're going to be fishing people. And there's some interesting kind of grammatical things that are happening here that don't always come through in the English translations. First of all, though, there is an echo here that connects to the earlier angelic responses, right? So because Peter, in a sense, is responding to Jesus's presence with fear, right? And we had the same thing earlier when angels would show up and announce the birth of Jesus, etc. People would be rightly fearful, and the angel would have to calm them. And Jesus says here, of course, do not be afraid, right? That's the first thing to calm the fear. What we might say, I think it'd be fair to say, is understandable fear. And then he speaks words, as it says here, of comfort and commission. And here is the grammatical piece, this fishers of people, right? So you will be catching people. The way that the Greek actually renders this is it's not just about fishing or people, it's that they will be caught alive. And so this, I just thought this was interesting because it came out of one of the commentaries that I was utilizing. And it's sort of a fine point kind of thing, but it's the kind of thing that adds a lot of pop to the imagery, right? Because on the one hand, on the one level, this analogy is interesting just because fishing, and trying to find people, right, that works. But on a different level, when you actually catch a fish, you're taking a fish out of its realm, its life-giving realm, and bringing it into death, because you're going to eat it more than likely, right? But the way the grammar is set up here is that they're going to be catching people who themselves are living in a situation of death and bringing them into the realm of the living, right? So the grammar, the Greek here does more than just say you're going to be catchers of people. It's saying something like you will catch them alive, right? You will catch them into life, maybe is another way of thinking about it. And that becomes then, in some sense, the ministry, the pattern of ministry, right? So if we think about Peter as commissioned not just as a disciple, but also later on then as an apostle, one who's sent forth, it is precisely in this process of sharing God's life-giving word with others, which has the ability to disrupt, to move people out of a realm, out of one situation and into another, potentially out of the realm of death or fear, or however we want to talk about that, into the realm of life. And I know we're kind of using kind of big concepts here in terms of that stuff, but you can translate that into any number of settings. Then we get verse 11. When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. That's just the most succinct statement of discipleship that I think we come across, certainly in the Gospel of Luke, right? So the call here of discipleship, or following after, to use sort of the German phrasing, and it's Peter, John, and James, right? And they have decided, as I mentioned before, they have the catch of their life, right? There's so many fish that they fill up their boat and another boat, and the boats almost start to sink. That's how extraordinary this is. And if you were a fisherman, that would be amazing, right? Because if that's your goal. And yet eventually, because of who they realize that Jesus is, they turn away from that, right? They allow their life purpose to be reoriented, I suppose we might say, to use kind of slightly different language. So as I mentioned here at the very bottom, discipleship requires, and I think this is the case in all of the Gospels, and I think this is also the thing that we all struggle with as we try to follow, and that is this idea that discipleship requires total commitment. And I think all of us are probably try to be committed, but sometimes the question is the totality right? Am I fully, totally committed? And what does that look like for me, right? As I mentioned here in the second clause, there's a genuine turning from other choices to truly follow after Jesus. And I really love this. I use the phrase following after. That's sort of the German rendering. The German word is Nachfolge. That's the word that typically is translated discipleship. And it literally just means following after, one who follows after. And so I tend to think about it in that sort of way. But so this, I think, gives us a lot, right? It not only gives us a scene of Jesus's own disciples, but I think all of the discipleship calling scenes are also scenes that address each of us, right? And that sort of raise the question, first of all, have we heard the call? Second, have we responded to the call? And third, are we trying to follow after? So let me stop there and see what kind of comments you might have before we move on to another scene.
Christian, there is a passage in Jeremiah 16:16 that talks about being fishers of men. That's more in context with exile and judgment. But
Can you read that passage?
yeah, let's see here. Let's see what we got here. And look, says the Lord, I will send for many fishermen, and they will fish for them. And afterwards I will send for many hunters, and they will hunt for them from every mountain and hill, and out of the caves and rocks. For I see all of their ways, and they're not hid from me. And so this is kind of a thought of judgment, but of that they'll be taken out of the land. But it is
Yeah.
it is the kind of the introduction of that thought of being a fisher of men.
Yeah, a fisher of men. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Tom.
But I like that the passage here that says you'll catch them alive. Yeah.
Yeah, and the grammar, you'll miss that if we don't kind of point it out, I suppose, just because the way the translation, because oftentimes translators are just they're doing their doggonedest to try to make it as clear as possible, but it doesn't always work that way, I suppose. Other comments or questions? Looks like
Christian,
yeah.
Christian, do all of the disciples ultimately, are they crucified and killed except for John who runs away to his island?
Yeah, so I don't know. I really only know this kind of vaguely, but my understanding is that, at least according to tradition, that all the disciples meet a gruesome death.
Yes.
Right? They're either killed by lions. There's a couple of them, according to tradition, that are crucified. Peter, of course, is crucified upside down. So yeah, the basic idea is that especially the early ones, those first 11, 12, that they experience that their witness, and this typically is the way that the tradition says, their witness is sealed in blood. Yeah, and so that's the kind of thing, though, that underlines this notion of total commitment, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
I mean, how willing are we to carry our faith that far?
Yeah.
So it's quite something. But
And I do think it's important for us to remember, and I tried to stress this when we were doing our class in the summer, the early Christian movement, that the vast majority of Christians were never persecuted. But there were some who clearly were persecuted, and their example then became kind of fodder and encouragement for other Christians to think about, well, what does it mean for me to be a true witness in my place and space, right? Am I willing to undergo what needs to be undergone? And I think that's the kind of thing that we can take from these kinds of examples of people who truly were committed. And I do think it's important here just to draw, because this, and I'm only doing this because we often hear this today. We hear the language of a martyr, right? And it typically has become associated with a suicide bomber or something like that. And I think it's important just to underline that these people were not going out looking to get killed.
No, I'm sure not.
or to kill other people.
No.
Right. And so there's an important distinction there that we want to keep in mind, and that original term martyr simply is just a word that means witness.
Chris, and the other thing that a lot of writers bring out about the disciples is that they're a person won't die for a lie. And so they're saying, this isn't just a made up story, because these people went the full distance.
Yeah, and I like that, and I like that, especially if we combine it with the comments I just made, because people may not die for a lie, but they'll certainly die for a delusion. And we see that with suicide bombers, right? They're willing to blow themselves up. I think the thing then that makes the difference, right, is that these are folks, right? These early disciples, these early apostles are not going out provoking and seeking death. And they're certainly not going out trying to kill other people in their act of death. And so I think all those things, it feels to me like they have to be combined. But the overarching point, right, becomes the issue of credibility. And that is the way that early Christians talked about and thought about martyrdom, was that if someone, was unwilling to recant their faith in the face of some sort of trial or persecution or something of that nature, it became a kind of sign of the depth of their credibility, that their witness could be sealed in their own blood. So yeah, I appreciate that comment, Tom.
Unlike a kamikaze type of attitude, they were actually more victimized by people that kind of wanted to stop and kill them, as opposed to them going out and taking other lives with their own life.
Right.
Like a suicide bomber or that type of thing.
That's right. That's right. That's the distinction. That's absolutely right.
Christian,
Yeah.
I remember looking this up one time, and it was, I came away from it that there was a heavy emphasis on tradition, and the tradition may have occurred after their deaths rather than before. Not to demean what a lot of them went through, but that wasn't a necessary thing that they had to go through in order to have authenticity.
Right. That's right. That's true as well. That's also sort of the other side of that two-edged sword. And some of the, say, for instance, if you read any of the modern day history on martyrdoms and martyrology, sometimes the author will say Christians have a martyr complex, right? We constantly think that we're being persecuted, and they're particularly talking about in countries like the United States or places like that. They're not talking about, excuse me, actual places where actual persecution is happening, which we know that is in fact going on in certain areas in the world. And so because of that, we also have to be careful, right, about the nature. But I do think it can all kind of boil down and be useful for us as a way of thinking about that this call is a call that does require all we've got, right? Everything you've got, that sense of total commitment. So I
Challenge.
appreciate those words.
Christian, I am intrigued with Peter's confession back in verses 8 through 10 as
Yeah.
just a picture of a person who consistently is being called to question as you go through the story of Jesus' ministry. And I mean, even as we move on further into the story, we find the disciples over and over again, not really getting it, not really understanding who he is. And Peter gets asked later, you know, who am I? Who do you say that I am? And then we get to the Holy Week story where he denies Christ. And then we get to the breakfast on the shoreline after the resurrection, where Jesus says, do you love me? Feed my sheep. So for me, it just gives another kind of a picture of what it means to be a disciple and a sinner at the same time. And
Amen.
being called back over and over again to what you said about Jesus speaking words of comfort and commission, and being called back to the work of Christ. And then we
Amen.
look at the life of Peter beyond, you know, in Acts and beyond, and being the stalwart, really the rock of the church and the founder of the church, and how much coming back to that commission over and over, and coming back to the words of Jesus and believing that he is who he says he is how things get done. It's how the gospel gets spread into the kingdom.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're totally touching on like a neuralgic, like a nerve point. Certainly for me, like, I don't know if this is, I'm assuming this is coming out of your own experience of, you know, you're in ministry, you're trying to be committed, and you fail. You don't always say the right thing, you don't always feel the right thing or think the right thing, and you don't always do the right thing. And the story of someone like Peter and the disciples as a whole, really, how clueless on a certain level that they were in the actual presence of Jesus, is I find very comforting, because they didn't have it all figured out, and Jesus abided with them, right? Jesus was patient, and continually calling them back, and I think that's absolutely right. And as you say, Peter is going to get singled out. I think it'd be fair to say that he sort of functions as the decipher for all the other disciples, because he really is the one who gets into trouble for a whole host of things. And yet, like you said, those words of comfort and calling, comfort and commission. I personally, honestly, this is one of the things I find truly remarkable too, just about the Christian story, is how there's no denying that God entrusts average, frail people with an extraordinary thing, right? Of trying to be a new community, of spreading God's word, of introducing people to Jesus in the depths of our own broken humanity. That God wants to use broken humans. I mean, and that God does use broken humans. There's an awful lot of grace and also head scratching in both of those. So anyway, I appreciate those thoughts. All right, well, let's transition then into another scene. As you're going to see, it's almost completely disconnected to a certain extent, at least in terms of chronology, because it just starts with once, right? So, and this is what I was mentioning before in terms of Luke's chronology in this section. He's not quite as concerned with it as perhaps we might be. But could I have a volunteer who's willing to read these verses?
I'll volunteer.
Okay, go ahead, Diane.
Okay. Once, when he was in one of the cities, there was a man covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. Then Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I do choose. Be made clean. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he ordered him to tell no one. Go, he said, and show yourself to the priest, and as Moses commanded, make an offering for your cleansing, for a testimony to them. But now, more than ever, the word about Jesus spread abroad. Many crowds would gather to hear him and to be cured of their diseases. But he would withdraw to the deserted places and pray.
Okay. So our scene shifts. We've had now then the calling of the disciples, and now we have this scene. I feel like this scene and the next scene both give us different ways of thinking about divine action. Right here in this particular case, we have a person who requests God's intervention, right, into their life. The next scene, we have an example of friends stepping in on behalf of someone, right? Because we're going to have the paralytic on the mat, and I think they give us two out of several, perhaps, different ways of thinking about what does it mean to call out to God. What does it mean to invite God into your life? Sometimes you're incapable of doing that and you need others to do it on your own behalf. It's kind of what the second story tells us. The first one, we get this really intimate request made by this man. So let me just kind of read through this first verse, and then we'll shift over to the others. Once, when he was in one of the cities, there was a man covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. So I don't have anything here on the outline for this, but as I mentioned, this is a great example of what I mean by the vagueness of these scenes, because we don't know exactly when this is happening or where, right? So once in one of the cities, that's all we get, right? But the important thing, of course, is the man. So the first thing to note is that this man is covered with leprosy, all right? So what does that mean? It means that it cannot be hidden, right? It is all over his body. There is no way for him to hide this away. Try as he might, perhaps he would, I don't know. But what that means, of course, according to the law, is that this man is essentially barred from the community, right? According to Leviticus chapters 13 and 14, effectively, this man would have been a social outcast, and there would really essentially be no way around this, right? Effectively, and so his suffering is not only the physical suffering of leprosy, it's also the suffering of exclusion. And I think without and I'm hoping that this doesn't trigger anything for anyone, but our experience of the pandemic and the need to have human contact with people, and how difficult that is. Now, we obviously have Zoom, and so we can talk to each other, and that would have been almost impossible for this person. Simply to go into his presence would have been to risk becoming unclean and maybe even contracting leprosy. But just think about the idea that this person can never be hugged, right? Cannot sit at the table and have a meal, right? That's the kind of suffering we're talking about. And that's what this guy wants to be set free from, right? It's not just this disease, it's what this disease does to you, and does to you in the context of community. So what does he say? Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean, right? If you are willing is another way that sometimes this phrase is translated. And I think it's fair to say that we have here then a clear expression of faith on behalf of this man, right? Trusting in Jesus, and therefore can be made clean. Let me stop here. I think I see a hand up, Terry.
Yes, this is very similar to my brother, who's basically in a nursing home, and his brain damage is severe to the point that he doesn't have any real cognitive ability at all. He's basically just kind of in a vegetative state. But when he got COVID-19, nobody could touch him. He was really isolated. And even once he got, thankfully he got better and is back in the nursing home now. However, not even his wife or anyone outside of the nursing home staff can visit him at all. So he has not been hugged or touched since last March, because Kentucky has a very draconian restriction of visiting nursing homes. I don't know if our Hervalds is like that up here, but I know my sister can visit my mother with Alzheimer's in a nursing home in Massachusetts, but Kentucky is very strict. And ever since, and still to this day, none of my brother's sons or grandchildren or his wife can see him beyond a video screen. And the only blessing is my brother's mental condition is so deteriorated, he's kind of unaware to know how to feel lonely. But it's the people outside, like his wife and family, that are really having a hard time with this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate those comments, Terry, and I'm really sorry to hear about that. As you were talking too, I was reminded, so I think I mentioned that my mentor had died earlier in the year back in May. And when he died, he was alone. No family was allowed to come in. It was in late April, early May, which is sort of the first spike. And he was out in California. And so they were on lockdown. But it's so I think we're experiencing something now with this, some of us directly, some of us more indirectly, and maybe some of us even third hand, through hearing stories like the one that you just shared, Terry, where we understand that this is not just a request by this man to be set free from a certain disease. It's a desire and a longing to be kind of put back into relationship, right? To be welcomed back into community. That we need to thrive, that we need on some level to be human. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much, Terry. Are there any other comments before I move us forward into the rest of the verses in this scene?
Christian, there is just a parallel here of Peter falling at the knees of Jesus, and here seeing the man of leprosy, seeing Jesus fell on his face.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely.
So this great devotion,
yeah. So that you're in the presence of holiness. That's great. I appreciate that observation.
But also the point here that Jesus touched him.
So let's not, hold on. Don't get too far ahead of me.
Okay.
Don't steal all my thunder, Tom. Come on. No, but you're absolutely right, because the begging that this guy does is met with something so extraordinary that it couldn't help but kind of overturn the normal expectation, right? So let me kind of read through the rest of this, and then we'll move into the next, because it connects directly to your point, Tom, and then I'll come back and draw you back in. But then Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, and said, "I do choose, be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he ordered him to tell no one. "Go," he said, "and show yourself to the priest, and as Moses commanded, make an offering for your cleansing for a testimony to them." Well, so before I get going too far, let me just kind of move us through verses 13 and 14. And the first one is it's this touching, right? Which we could miss, we could pretty easily glide over. But basically what Jesus does here is he allows himself to be unclean, to be made unclean, effectively, right? Basically, he enters into the situation of this man precisely to set this man free. So in the ancient world, to touch an unclean person was then to make oneself unclean. Whether you contracted the disease or not was beside the point. You effectively entered into their station. This is what I was getting at with this person can't even get a hug, right? Effectively, to a certain extent, more than likely. And I think we can take from this what I say here, which is a much broader point, and one that is demonstrated, I think, throughout the Gospels, and that is that Jesus' unwillingness to allow anyone to be lost, and his willingness to travel into the most God-forsaken of spaces, signified in this particular case with the leprosy, and just the profound aloneness, like feeling truly God-forsaken. Think about that. I mean, think about truly. It's the law, right? It's the religious code that is basically saying that he cannot be involved in the community. He would have truly felt God-forsaken, right? Why would you not have felt God-forsaken? And yet Jesus reaches into that situation and in a sense enters into it and becomes like him. Here it's not quite as clear as the way that when Jesus becomes like the woman who touches him and the power flows out from him, but it's a similar kind of thing of allowing of skin to skin touch, right, and identification in order to set this man free, right? And to underline it, right, I do choose, right? And I think this is, to me, like this is one of those places where the gospel is encapsulated. That God has chosen to come and be in our midst to set us free. That's the meaning. That's what the good news is. It's God's will that we be set free, that we be healed, that we be made the fullness of who we are and who we can be, that we learn to love others and ourselves, and creation itself in the way that God loves these realities. So this is such a profound kind of scene. So then Jesus, of course, gives him instruction, and this instruction is in keeping with the tenets of the law, right? Which is, and this again, that there's a sort of interesting tension in all the Gospels between Jesus's relationship with the law. But he instructs the man to basically do what he's required to do, right? And he ordered him to tell no one. Go, he said, and show yourself to the priest, and as Moses commanded, make an offering for your cleansing for a testimony to them. So in keeping with what we've seen already, just in terms of just the overview of Luke, one of the things that Luke is interested in doing is emphasizing the fact that Jesus, of course, is a pious and observant Jew. He spends his time in synagogue, right? His parents were pious people, etc. So he's not configured primarily as someone outside of that world. As it says here, the examination by the priest, in a sense, is what would lead to the final sort of event of restoration. So once the priest examines the person and they make their offering, then they're declared clean, and that means they're declared able to re-enter the community. So there's a certain sense in which the miracle that Jesus is performed is going to receive a kind of imprimatur or stamp of approval that then will restore this person fully, which is, of course, the final aim of this. So he commands him not to say anything, But then we get in verse 15, right? But now more than ever, the word about, and so, right, it doesn't say that the man went around telling everyone, but the implication seems to be pretty clear. But now more than ever, the words about Jesus spread abroad. Many crowds would gather to hear him and to be cured of their diseases, but he would withdraw to deserted places and pray. So two components here. One, Jesus's reputation spreads, pretty straightforward, right, in terms of here. And I think the dynamic of why is Jesus withdrawing himself when he came precisely to spread the news is explicable if we go back to the pattern established in the village of Nazareth, and then the same thing we hear about in Capernaum, and now we sort of see, and that, what is that? It's that people and communities attach themselves to Jesus in an attempt to keep him for themselves and not let him go. And he's had to say a couple of different times, I came also for the others. And so there are times when he has to withdraw himself. And of course, to withdraw himself and to pray is obviously to connect to the center, the thing that sustains him in the fulfilling of his mission. So withdrawing to a solitary place to pray is meant to emphasize that that Jesus's purposes are not so much driven by Jesus as by his desire to be faithful to God's call on his life, right? And this is why in the book of Hebrews, we hear this really interesting thing, which is that in some sense, Jesus is the forerunner for us. And what I mean by that is that not only do we follow after Jesus, but we're in a sense following after God, right? He devoted the entirety of his existence to being a faithful covenant partner with Yahweh. He was faithful unto death. And that faithfulness, that following after, in a sense, that places him also in our camp. He is also in some sense a disciple. Obviously we have to nuance that, but so again, he has to withdraw himself, re-energize himself, and relocate. This also, of course, indicates that the shift is coming. Whenever it talks about Jesus praying, we know that something else is about to come around the corner. And it's about 11:32, so I think I'll stop us there because we jump into this next scene and it's pretty big and beautiful, but I think we'll wait and deal with that next week. Let me stop there though and see what kind of comments or questions that you have.
I just had a thought. When Jesus goes away to pray, in a practical sense, it's kind of like going home and talking to your parents. You know, you just need that. You need that connection. You need to talk to your mom or your dad and maybe get their wisdom or their perspective. And that's when you come away more resourceful and more healed and ready to step out again.
Yeah, and I think reminded of who you are and where you come from.
Right.
I see it. Two things are jumping out at me. Definitely all that's been said is so, and I think that's primary. In today's context, I see Jesus, going someplace and being alone for a while, and it's kind of like we are to be the Jesus, and Jesus isn't going to come and do it all. We have a responsibility here. And the line in verse 13 of I do choose, I need to choose. And I think of people I knew of in the past that hid Jews. And yes, the Jews were saved, but the bigger picture was that people became involved and had to risk. And I see now in COVID, I don't know what to do with this lesson. Except support those that are frontliners, but there is that feeling of, how do we do Jesus' hand in some of these things, these pandemics? Our two next door neighbors have just died this last week
Hmm.
from COVID. And
Goodness.
how do what do I do? How do I support? Because I do need to choose.
Good.
That seems a little far-fetched maybe, but
No, I
those
mean,
two,
it's,
they
that's
really
the-
jump out at me.
that's the reality that we're living in right now, right? And I think that's been part of the struggle to some extent within maybe the Christian community around, COVID restrictions and things like that. Because on the one hand, we need to be cognizant and wise and safe, and there's all kinds of precedent for this in the history of Christianity, like the bubonic plague. They suspended services. There are numerous examples of this going back into the 3rd century. So this is not, that part's not new. But I think the other part is, and that when I do think about the examples, it does tend to be finding ways to support those who are trained precisely to do that kind of work. And then we're really blessed on a certain level in the sense that we have this technology,
Amen.
right? So I think about finding ways to reach out to one another by utilizing our technology, right? By calling, Zooming, which can be exhausting too. But sometimes people just need to see a face and hear a voice, or maybe they need to say something and have someone hear, and it's nice to see someone on the other end. Or maybe you can do something in your backyard too. I'm so sorry to hear that though, Peggy. That's got to be quite a shaking thing to hear that two of your neighbors
They're
have
the
passed away.
sixth people that
Oh.
we know very, very well.
Wow.
All elderly, I will say. But how do we be Jesus to these people? And I write a lot of letters. I take a lot of food. I do not mingle. I distance. We're very careful, Frank and I. But I think of in the past what people did.
I had my first death of a close relative, cousin, of COVID-19 just last week. And it was not so much, she was 89 and she was very, very sharp as a tack and didn't have Alzheimer's or any of the, she was even still in her original house. But the heartbreak is not so much the death and the loss of her, but there's absolutely no funeral, not even a Zoom funeral. They just said, nope, she just decided to spread her ashes up at the cabin and not even have anyone up there to be with the ash spreader because she knew how contagious this was. But still, when it hits close to home and it's a close relative and you can't do a funeral, any other time in history, funerals were always kind of a way to kind of have closure and even have a little family reunion as a kind of a benefit. But now with no funerals, I think that's very hard to deal with.
Yeah, and I would say too, when my sister got killed,
Yeah.
they had a funeral, and it turned into a super spreader event. And my father got COVID, and my aunt got COVID, and there were several other people that got COVID, and my aunt almost died because she got a massive blood clot in her lung. And I felt so bad that I couldn't go to the funeral. And then of course later on I was like, well, I'm glad I didn't go to the funeral. But it is precisely what you're talking about, Terry, because I don't think they still haven't had a funeral, to my knowledge, for my mentor who died back in March or April. Yeah, and those things that those are markings, markings for births, markings for deaths, birthdays, all that stuff. We're having to figure out how to do that differently. And I think we do feel, I hope that we feel that this is not going to be interminable. It's not going to go on forever. But the willingness to find ways to be safe, but also to be supportive, that's our calling. And certainly I'm praying for you, Peggy and Frank, as you're figuring that out. And all of us,
Oh,
really,
we're
I'm
good.
sure all of us on the screen are
good.
having, and some of us on the screen I know have actually had the disease, have actually had COVID. And so, yeah, so it's no joke.
The good thing is, at least for me, is that I'm finding that I'm rethinking things. Funerals, weddings, birth parties, etc. Sometimes maybe it loses its focus and it just becomes a gathering.
Right, a habit.
Yeah. So they'll be good in this. In all things, there is good to those
Yeah.
who believe. So
I'm kind of hoping that that same thing's going to happen as we think about church.
mm,
Why do we come together? What's the purpose? Because I know we're missing it, and I know some folks are, they're even going to other places because they're frustrated that we're not gathering in the ways that they would like to do that, and that's certainly their prerogative to do that. But I also feel like it might give us a pause to be able to think about what is it that is, not just that we're commanded to do it, right? To not give up meeting with one another, but what is it that happens in that setting when we actually do come together? Why are we doing that? What's going on there? So that it's not just a habit. Every Sunday morning we go and we see people, etc. Well, I'm gonna